You've heard the jokes. Okay, boomer. The memes, the generational blame, the endless cultural shorthand that flattens an entire generation into a punchline about avocado toast and housing prices. But here's what nobody actually stops to examine: the psychology underneath. The specific, documentable, historically shaped set of experiences that produced the boomer worldview. Not as a defense of it, not as a criticism of it, but as an honest attempt to understand where it actually came from. Because the baby boomer generation, born between 1946 and 1964, didn't arrive at their psychology by accident. They were built by a world that no longer exists. And understanding that world is the only way to make sense of the people it produced. Picture this. It's 1952. You're 6 years old. Your father came home from the war. Your mother kept the house running while he was gone. Nobody talked about what happened over there. Nobody talked about what it cost her either. You just watched both of them get up every morning and do what needed to be done, without complaint, without processing, without any language for what they were carrying. And you took notes. The boomer generation was raised almost entirely by the silent generation and the greatest generation, people who had survived the Great Depression and World War II. People for whom suffering was not a conversation topic. It was just Tuesday. Psychologists who study intergenerational trauma have identified what they call transmitted resilience, the passing down not just of trauma, but of the coping strategies developed to survive it. The boomer child didn't just observe their parents' stoicism. They absorbed it. They internalized it as the correct emotional response to hardship. You didn't fall apart. You kept going. That wasn't cruelty. That was the only psychological model available. But here's what made the boomer childhood genuinely extraordinary and genuinely contradictory. They were raised by scarcity, but grew up in abundance. The post-war economic boom produced the most prosperous period in American history. The GI Bill sent their fathers to college. Suburban housing developments created the first generation of widespread middle-class homeownership. Television entered the living room. Supermarkets replaced victory gardens. The future, for the first time in decades, felt not just possible, but inevitable. And the boomer child grew up inside that contradiction, raised by parents who remembered having nothing, but surrounded by more than any previous generation had ever known. Psychologists call this relative deprivation reversal, the psychological dissonance that occurs when a generation is socialized through scarcity narratives while experiencing material abundance. The result is a generation that simultaneously believes in the promise of prosperity and remains quietly anxious that it could disappear. That anxiety never fully left. It just went underground. Then the 1960s happened, and everything their parents told them to believe in, the institutions, the authority, the social order, started cracking at the seams. The assassination of JFK, then Bobby Kennedy, then Martin Luther King, Vietnam, Watergate, the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the counterculture, the summer of love. The boomer generation didn't just witness social upheaval. They were its architects. They marched, they protested, they burned draft cards and broke rules, and fundamentally challenged every assumption their parents' generation had handed them about how the world was supposed to work. And here's the fascinating psychological paradox at the center of the boomer experience. They were simultaneously the most idealistic and the most disillusioned generation in modern American history. They believed, genuinely, passionately, with the full force of youth, that they could change the world. And then they watched those ideals collide with the complexity of actually running one. The revolution they started in their 20s became the compromise they lived with in their 40s. The generation that marched against the establishment eventually became it. Psychologists call this ideological attrition, the gradual erosion of radical belief systems under the sustained pressure of adult responsibility, economic reality, and institutional inertia. It didn't make them hypocrites. It made them human.
And then came the work. Because if there is one thing that defines the boomer psychology more than anything else,
More than the idealism, more than the disillusionment, more than the generational contradictions, it is the relationship with work. The boomer generation didn't just work hard, they built their identities around it. This wasn't accidental, it was modeled. Their parents had survived the Depression by working, had won a war by working, had built the American dream, brick by brick, hour by hour, through work. And the message passed down was clear. Your value is what you produce. Psychologists have identified this as Protestant work ethic internalization, the deeply embedded belief, passed through generations of American culture, that hard work is not just a means to an end, but a moral virtue in itself. That idleness is dangerous, that productivity is identity. Here's something that should genuinely reframe the way you think about boomer psychology. A landmark study from the American Psychological Association found that baby boomers report significantly higher levels of stress, depression, and chronic illness than their parents' generation did at the same age, despite being wealthier, better educated, and more medically supported. The generation that had the most also reported some of the lowest well-being scores of any age cohort studied. The researchers traced this back to a single consistent factor: unprocessed expectation. The boomer generation was the first to be explicitly promised that life, if lived correctly, would be fulfilling. The self-help movement was born on their watch. The therapy industry exploded during their adulthood. The concept of personal happiness as a life goal, rather than a pleasant side effect of a life well lived, entered the cultural vocabulary largely through their generation. And when the fulfillment didn't arrive on schedule, or arrived and then left, the gap between what they were promised and what they experienced produced a specific kind of psychological weight that their parents' stoicism never equipped them to carry. They had the tools to endure, but nobody gave them the tools to feel. Let's talk about the boomer relationship with change. The boomer resistance to certain kinds of change isn't simply stubbornness or ignorance or a failure of imagination. It's the predictable psychological response of a generation that experienced too much change, too fast, with too little stability to anchor it. They watched their country change completely in the span of a decade. They watched institutions they were raised to trust collapse in real time. They watched the social contract their parents built get renegotiated without anyone asking their permission. And so they held on. Not to the past specifically, but to the feeling of solid ground beneath their feet, to the comfort of systems that had at least briefly worked, to the structures that had, despite everything, produced the most prosperous period in human history. Psychologists call this system justification theory, the cognitive tendency to defend and justify existing social structures, particularly among individuals who feel that those structures have historically provided stability and reward. It's not that boomers can't imagine a different world. It's that they've already lived through what happens when the world changes faster than the people in it can adapt. And they didn't always like what they saw. Because here's what the boomer psychology ultimately produced. Beneath the contradictions, beneath the work ethic, beneath the idealism and the disillusionment and the complicated legacy, a generation of people who believed, at their core, that life was supposed to mean something. They were human beings trying to make sense of an extraordinary moment in history, with the emotional vocabulary they were given, the models they were shown, and the world they were handed. Just like every generation before them, just like every generation that will come after. The work of understanding each other across generational lines isn't about winning the argument. It's about asking, with genuine curiosity and genuine compassion, what world produced this person? And what did that world ask them to become? If this gave you a new lens for understanding the generation that shaped yours, subscribe to Mentra Psychology. The next video goes even deeper into the psychology of the generations living alongside each other, and what understanding them might actually make possible. Click it. You'll understand why.